Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Oliver Hooper, and along with Yue Zhu and another colleague, Johan Ismail, we are the conveners for the BERA ECR network. So we're going to start off today just by telling you a little bit about the network. It's for those who are in the process of studying for their master's or doctorate in education, or those who have finished their studies in the past 5 years. The idea behind the network is to provide opportunities for ECRs to engage with their peers in order to develop their knowledge and skills, to network and collaborate, and to feel connected to BERA and that broader academic community. We do this in a number of ways, through targeted email newsletters, through regular features in Research Intelligence magazine, as well as a dedicated Twitter feed that was shared with you on the previous slide at BERA_ECR network. And we also have a number of events. Annually, we organise a dedicated symposia series for early career researchers, and also run workshops just like this, which has gone digital in current times, all about writing for publication. We also have dedicated pots of funding and awards for early career researchers, including the Master's and Doctoral Thesis Awards that are currently open for applications. So please do check those out and get some applications submitted for those. And we'd also encourage you to consider subscribing for membership to BERA. If you subscribe at the moment, you get the remainder of 2023 along with the whole of 2021. So it's a really good opportunity to join and become a part of that ECR network. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Yue, who's going to introduce today's event for you.
Thanks, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to attend this Academic for Publications event hosted by the BERA ECR network together with Chinese Educational Research Association. So our Academic for Publications workshop are one of our flagship events in the past years. And as you may know, because of the COVID-19, we've moved this event online this year. But we might bring that back to offline again next year together with CERA, and also we will consider continuous online webinars in order to benefit a wider group of ECRs internationally. So today we're very honored to have invited Dr. Yang Hu from Lancaster University to deliver this webinar. He's a very well-published researcher in transnational mobilities and family relationships. So I'm handing over to Yang, who will be introducing himself a little bit further and as part of his talk. Let's welcome Yang. Thanks.
Great. I'm just waiting for a minute for my slides to come on my screen. But in the meantime, great, it's not on the screen. Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Lancaster. My name is Yang Hu. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at Lancaster University. So before we start, shall I ask us to do an interactive activity? So can you just quickly indicate on Slido, what is your current career stage? Great. Now we are giving responses. So we can see on the screen, it's still live. Most of us are doctoral researchers and some of us are postdocs. And I also see some senior scholars here. It's still changing. I look forward to exchanging ideas with you on publication and academic writing, particularly in the discussion session we have. Now I'm going to quickly move on to the next slide, so the poll will potentially stop. Great. When I was preparing for this talk, I quickly typed into Google Books academic publishing, and I was shocked. 27 million items and books on academic publishing. Then out of curiosity, I just typed in my own field, sociology of families. And by comparison, I only yielded about 2 million books. Then very quickly, I decided in 45 minutes, I'm not able to trump those 27 million some books. So I decided to speak from my personal experience, as there is no right or wrong way of writing or publishing. My personal experience is very much situated in the social science discipline PhD mode in the UK. I appreciate the different ways of organizing a PhD or postdoc program in the United States, in China, or elsewhere. My PhD was fully funded, which meant I had to do minimal teaching, although I did do some teaching to foster my teaching skills and experience during my PhD. I had one of the most supportive supervisor and also supportive family. Methodology does determine how we write and how we publish. My research was a blend of qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research. I didn't have any major issues with my ethical clearance and data access, although I did encounter some of the common problems and issues, such as data not being clean enough, data not necessarily fit for purpose, or respondents rejected to take part in my research. As you might have already gathered, I'm a non-native English speaker. I was an international student, now an international academic. So I'll be touching upon briefly on the topic of how to publish, how to write in a different language and culture. To give you an overview of the talk today, I will start by demonstrating that it is possible to publish and write during and after your PhD. Then I'll move on to talk about why we write and why we publish and how we do it. What do we publish? Do we do it by collaboration or do we do it on our own? I'll spend just a tiny bit of time on what do we do after publication, and then I'll recap and re-emphasize the importance of how we learn and care through writing and publishing. It is possible to publish during and after your PhD, but no one said it's easy. During my PhD from 2011 to 2015, I had one journal article rejected after peer review and one book proposal rejected after peer review. And after my PhD from 2016 to 2020, as I submitted more works to different outlets, I had more rejections. 5 journal articles rejected outright, desk reject, and 5 of which were attributed to one article, and 6 articles rejected after review, 4 of which were attributed to one article. But the good news is it's also possible to publish. During my PhD, I also published 2 peer-reviewed journal articles. You never forget about your first one in the Journal of Family Issues, and my second one in Journal of Marriage and Family. After my PhD, from 2016 to 2020, I published 1 book chapter, 2 project reports, and 19 peer-reviewed articles. So it is entirely possible to publish despite all of the difficulties of getting things written and published. To think about writing and publishing, we have to think about why do we do it in the first place. So before I share my own experience, can I please ask you to type on the screen just a few words? What is the motivation for you to publish and write? Great, I can see some responses are already coming in. Share research findings, enhance career, disseminating findings, make your voice heard, to share knowledge. REF, yes, in the UK. Advanced knowledge, inform policy. It's a requirement. Give participants a voice. Great, in about a few seconds, I'm just going to move on to the next slide, which means the poll will potentially stop. I can see the diverse range of reasons why we publish and why we write. So I'll move on to share my experiences of why I wrote and why I published. So foremost, at the very beginning of my academic career, when I was doing my PhD, I treated writing as a research process. Writing is not just about bringing our thinking to people, but when we were doing research, writing was actually very helpful for us to gather information, synthesize information, and process info through our minds. Writing is a great way for us to clarify our thinking, at least for me. I admire the philosophical quote that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Indeed, very true. If I read something or if I digest some findings from my interview-based research or quantitative research, if I don't fully understand them, I will probably struggle to put them into words. So I use writing as an integral part of my research process. As many of you just have shared with us, you write, we write to share our research findings. But I divide my research dissemination into different stages. Quite often, I write conference papers and short reports to communicate my research in progress. And then when my research has come to a certain milestone, I use journal publications and book publications to demarcate a certain milestone and achievement in my research process. But above all, I do love writing. I feel writing is a part of my hobby and is a great enjoyment in my life. As we have seen from the previous screen, there are instrumental purposes for us to write and publish. In the UK, we have REV. Elsewhere, especially at our career stage, we have to think about whether we are compelled, in a sense, to write and publish to get a job and to seek career advancement. So when the instrumental reasons are blended into our enjoyment of the research process, disseminating our findings and reach our targeted audience, it's quite a challenge, I find, to balance the fun part and the sort of external pressure of publishing. So I also look forward to discussing that part with you during the Q&A session. Once we decided that we need to write for ourselves or for external reasons, we need to be thinking about what do we publish? A book, a journal article, or chapter, or whatever else. So I would like to ask you to answer this question. In an ideal world, let's set aside the external pressure. What would you prefer to publish in your current research? Whether it's a book, book chapter, journal article, research report, or others. I'm seeing the responses coming in, so I'm going to soon move to the next slide. Great, I see the majority of us are thinking about publishing journal articles and a book. So actually my talk is going to primarily focus on those two different formats, although I will also touch upon some of the other formats, such as research reports, others, book chapter. So now I'm going to move on to the next slide. So personally, I have published a book, journal articles, one book chapter, and a few research reports. I know some of my other colleagues, they have done fantastic work in producing films, art, and comics in disseminating their research findings. I have limited experience in those different areas, but so here primarily, I'm going to focus on book and journal article publication. How do we choose and weigh between those two formats? First and foremost, we have to think about the contents and materials, whether it's suited for long form publication or whether it's suited for short form publication, quick turnaround. So in my PhD, as you can see on the screen, I published my own PhD as a book on Chinese-British intermarriage. I decided early on in my PhD that the contents were more suited for more coherent form, long form of presentation instead of small, shorter journal articles. The style of writing does matter. When we think about journal publication, there is more or less a sort of a set standard template of how we write. We have an introduction, theoretical section, methodology, findings, and then discussion for journal articles. But when you write a book, we have much more freedom, greater freedom to think about how we divide our work into different chapters, how greater freedom to think about how we present our findings. How we decide between a book or report or a journal article is pretty much dependent on our intended readership. If we plan to disseminate our finding to policymakers, it's quite difficult for them to get hold of a long form book for them to sit on the table and to read through a book. So in those instances, I quite often find short reports to be very effective. But if we want to communicate with an academic debate, we engage with the ongoing debates going on in certain journals. So our intended readership pretty much determines who we are writing for. After all, we are not just writing for ourselves, we write to convey our ideas and our thoughts. Book or journal article, the format of publication also determines how we organize our research. I find personally in a book, you always have to think about how the different chapters hand together, how this whole piece of work, long piece of work, hand together as a holistic thing. But in journal articles, I know in some systems, you write 3 journal articles for a PhD dissertation, which allows you a greater flexibility and relative independence between the chapters, although they are related, to develop your work. One thing also for us to bear in mind, especially at early career stage, is to think about the publication timeframe. It usually takes longer to publish a book as opposed to journal articles, primarily because to publish a book, you have to go through multiple stages of the publication process. In the first instance, you submit a book proposal with a couple of sample chapters, and then you deliver the full manuscript. So it's a multi-stage delivery process. But for journal article, you submit your journal article for peer review, and then it comes back for revision and potentially publication. Whatever format you choose to publish, one career advice, one of the most important career advice I have received in my PhD was to plan early. Day one, the first supervision meeting I had with my PhD advisor, she asked me the question, have you ever thought about how do you plan to disseminate your PhD research findings? Do you plan to write a book, journal articles, book chapters? Then that really got me going, thinking about how I planned to disseminate my research finding. And in the end, I decided on that I wanted to write a book in the first year of my PhD. And that really helped me from early on to organize my research, to think about the style in which I write my research to be accessible, to be relatively jargon-free, and to also think about how I divide my materials into different chapters. So actually, as soon after my PhD graduation, I submitted my book proposal and sample chapters. Then it was accepted almost right away after a few minor changes. And then it was published just 9 months after my PhD graduation. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't planned my PhD to be a book from early on. Of course, there are different objectives for us to publish internally, externally. So journal articles and books, they are valued in different systems. To think about our career advancement and what's valued in different systems probably will also be helpful for us to think about our publication plan. Above all, irrespective of all of those external pressure and so on, we need to enjoy whatever we write. I have heard from some of my friends, they don't really like the style of writing for journal articles that really limits them to express their intellectual ideas. Then writing a book will be a more appropriate format for some of us. Once we decide what we want to publish, then how do we write and publish? So in my experience, after the past number of years, I formulated a habit of regular and daily writing. So I do write on a daily basis, no matter how little I write, even if it's just one paragraph, a few sentences, I do keep writing every day. Over the years, I developed 3 modes of writing for myself that worked really well for me. The first mode of writing was rapid writing, but extensive editing. I use it for journal articles. I write and draft a journal article very rapidly in about 2 to 3 days, 8,000 words. And then I spend days and weeks editing this piece of work. I find it very useful for journal articles because in one go, you can pull all of your ideas consistently together within a short period of time. Then you have a lengthened period of time to refine your work. A second mode of writing, I term it fine, slow writing. I use it for my PhD thesis and my book. I wrote about just one page. I wasn't able to produce more than one page every day. But when I was producing the one page, I did sink in to think about my data, the narratives from my respondents, the theories I want to put in, how am I choosing different words to accurately and concisely present my ideas. So after fine, slow writing, I find quite often only minimal editing was required for it. But as I stepped into my lectureship, teaching and admin responsibilities crept up onto my schedule. Then I find my writing time was considerably squashed. Then I developed the third mode of writing I call snippet writing. So on my iPhone, I just type in whatever comes to my mind during my commute onto campus and back from campus, or any moments when inspirations come to me. Quite often I find inspirations, once they come, they can go very quickly. If you don't note it down, they can just slip away. So I have a file on my phone, noting down the pieces and bits of my thinking. And then at a later date, I piece them together to be a bigger piece of writing. It's not only just about those different modes of writing I experimented with, but rather I find it's very useful for me to alternate between the different modes of writing. For example, it's impossible for me to just do rapid writing a day on and day off. And I wasn't able to have the level of concentration to do fine writing all the time. So it was really useful for me to alternate between the different modes of writing. But when I first started my PhD, thinking about having to write a 75,000 words, 80,000 words, a piece of work, that was really daunting to me. I remember when I was first sitting in front of a computer, an empty Word document, I was so afraid to put down any words. They just don't come to me. What was really useful for me to start with was to find a very good template for me to follow. So there are two books on the screen, one called The Second Shift and one came out later called The Outsourced Self, written by Professor Ali Hochschild at UC Berkeley. I find them to be really good templates. I enjoy reading and I can really imitate the writing style in those two books. That really got me started to think about how I write and to get my words flowing. But it happens to the best of us, writer's block. Sometimes we sit in front of a computer 1 hour, 2 hours, words just don't come to us. So my first turn to unblocker, again, were those good templates. But sometimes still those words just don't come to me. It's so frustrating. You start to doubt your value and existence, to think about whether you're fit for purpose to do academic work. Then often I just give up and switch on to other tasks, to do data analysis, to make me feel better, to think about I can still be good at doing something at least. So far, we have been talking about writing and we have been talking about piling words. But then later on, I find that cutting is an equally important skill when it comes to academic writing. In my publication experience, I had one article early on in about 2015. I withdrew from a journal submission because the editor required me to cut about 3,000 words out of a 10,000 word piece. I decided I wasn't able to do it. Then I submitted the article to a different journal and got it published. But in retrospect, thinking about it, I could have done it. Then throughout my publication experience, I realized to do cutting is actually a good way of sorting out the priorities, the contribution of your research. It really gives us a chance to sit down and reflect on what we are writing about and what we are thinking about. Once we have those priorities in our mind, we can very quickly start to decide which parts are tangentially relevant to our key points, our key contributions. Then we can cut down our writing. Once we have a piece of writing in mind, then we have to choose an outlet for it. When it comes to a book publisher, some points to consider are whether a publisher has a book series, for example, in family and gender studies, in educational studies, in early years education. Those will provide you with a very good place to position your book, to read the past books published in a given series. And another thing we need to think about is pricing. When I published my first book, I didn't really think about pricing. But later on, it came to me, if I'm writing for general audience, I want more people to read my book. It doesn't make sense if a book is priced at the price point of £200, £120, and no one is able to buy it apart from mainstream libraries on universities. Another thing for us to think about are the countries covered. Are we speaking to a North American audience, British audience, European audience, Chinese audience, Japanese audience? When we are speaking to different audiences, we need to make sure that our publishers are covering those countries. They have channels of disseminating books to those places. When choosing a journal, I'd like to share my experience of 5 desk rejections for one article with you. The article is shown on the screen, called Attitudes Toward Transnational Intermarriage in China, in which I was testing 3 theories of transnationalization. I first submitted the article to a family journal, thinking, oh, it's on intermarriage, isn't it? Then within a couple of weeks, the editor got back to me saying, you're studying transnational intermarriage. Then it might be more appropriate for a migration journal. Then I took the article to a migration journal. Within a few days, 2-3 days, the editor got back to me saying, oh, it might be more suitable for a family journal or for a globalization journal. Then it was desk rejected again. Then I took it to a globalization journal. They told me, you're studying social attitudes. Why don't you try a public opinion journal? Then I submitted to a public opinion journal. Then it was desk rejected again because the subject matter is really on intermarriage and population issues. At last, I submitted this article to demographic research, and the article was conditionally accepted after a couple of months with only minor changes to make, and then it was published. What have I learned from this experience? Well, first of all, I did experience the challenge of publishing the interdisciplinary research. When your research sits at the intersection of multiple areas, we really have to think about what kind of debates are we engaging with and which outlets are supportive of publishing interdisciplinary research. Then later on, throughout my experiences, I've also learned to read the journals more deeply before I submit my articles to them, to think about which debates are going on in those journals, what are the past publications in those journals. What I have also learned is that desk rejection doesn't necessarily mean the quality of your research is not good enough. It's just a judgment of the fit between your work and a given journal. So reading a lot of the published stuff in a given journal, capturing what are the ongoing debates in those journals are really helpful for us to position ourselves. Turnaround time does matter. So in my publication experience, my fastest journal article was accepted for publication in 3 weeks' time, but the longest dragged on for about 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years. Especially at our current career stage, we need to think about how long it takes for us to get published, especially we need to look for a job or need to advance our careers. One last thing to, fortunately, in terms of turnaround time, when I first started publishing about 5-6 years ago, most journals didn't publish when an article was submitted, when it's published. But fortunately nowadays, most journals, they have those dates included in articles. So if we check most of the articles published in a given journal, we can get a sense of what's the time frame on average to publish an article. Lastly, we need to think about whether our publications are open access. So I like demographic research because they publish all articles open access for free. So it helps you to reach a broader audience. Quite often we hear the phrase, publishable standard. Our supervisors might tell us and friends might tell us it's not yet at a good publishable standard, or it is already a publishable. But what is a publishable standard? It's really difficult to gauge. So sometimes it develops with experience, but by experience, I'm not talking about our own experiences alone. It can include other people's experience. In my first ever publication shown on the screen on family and gender values in China, I did this publication with my PhD supervisor, Professor Jackie Scott. After draft 3, I told Jackie, I thought it's really ready for submission. Let's just go ahead and submit it to the journal we had chosen. Then Jackie went back to me, said, oh, it's not ready. It's not yet at the publishable standard. Then she very patiently pointed out the different bits and pieces I need to improve in order to push it towards a publishable standard. Then after draft 9, draft 10, draft 11, we were finally at the point of being able to submit the piece of what we agreed to be a publishable standard. So learning from experienced scholars, your PhD supervisor, your colleagues, more experienced colleagues and peers, that's really helpful for us to understand what it takes to get published. But over the years, I have also learned it's not enough to just fill a gap for us to get published. So we can't just say something's not done before in the literature, it's original, then it's worthy of publication. It's probably ticking the first box called originality for us to publish. But in order to fill that gap, we also need to make sure that by filling that gap, we are making a significant contribution to knowledge and theory. We need to be thinking about whether also we are using an innovative methodology to answer a question in a robust way. So those are some of the questions we need to be thinking about going beyond, oh, I'm filling a gap, I'm doing something that's not been done before. Quite often when we read journal articles, it's so much easier for us to criticize than do it ourselves. We say a journal article looks pretty simple, but when it comes to doing it, when it comes to my doing it, I find it's so difficult to achieve that level of simplicity and clarity in writing and in compiling your research. So what we can do is to do our best and perhaps push ourselves to do that a little bit more, and then do remember to ask for help. We are not alone in the publication process, and there are a lot of other people who can read our work to tell us, are we ready to submit? In the publication process, rejection hurts. It hurts so much, but if it's of any counsel, knowing that rejections are unfortunately the norm in academic publishing probably makes us feel better. At the bottom of the screen, I have quoted a couple of numbers from different journals. In the American Sociological Association and their journal, American Sociological Review, only accepts about 5.9% of all papers. In my own area, gender and society, they accept only about 10% of all papers submitted to it. That means, well, if we submit a journal article, 9 out of 10 chances that it will be rejected. But we should be thankful for desk rejections. Desk rejection means the editors are actively reading your work and they are just deciding whether your paper is suitable for a given journal, so they can just reject it right away, not wasting the time to go through the whole peer review process and then come back to you to say it's not suitable. Once we have a rejection, we need to keep calm and carry on. At least what I have learned from the rejections during my PhD was it was really helpful for me to improve my PhD work. So taking on board the reviewer suggestions on my submitted works related to my PhD thesis and my PhD book, I ended up not having to do any correction and passed my PhD viva straight away. That was really helpful for me to learn from the rejection experience. Equally important is to learn from the revision process. Outright acceptance is rare, if not impossible, in academia. So in my very limited publication experience, I have never had any article accepted outright. The nearest I've got to it is conditional acceptance with some very minor changes. So if you have a revision invitation, it's time to celebrate. Once you have the reviews from the reviewers, I take most of them positively. Reviewers are not enemies. They are there to help us to improve our work, to help us to publish, to realize the potential of our work. So I take most of the reviews positively. But in some instances, inevitably, sometimes you do receive aggressive, non-constructive peer reviews. In those cases, please just feel free to discard them. One of the most important career advice, how to deal with reviewer comments I received from my PhD advisor, was during my first publication I did with her. On seeing the 3 reviews coming back, I thought, oh, I did say some of the things the reviewer questioned about in my paper. Why are they even questioning it? It's just in there in the paper. Have they even read it? That's the question that I naively asked back then. But then my advisor said, well, if the reviewers got it wrong, would you like to think about have you put your writing clearly enough for them to really capture your meaning? Then I reflected on my writing. And I came to realize after a couple of rounds of reading my article again, I didn't really put my ideas across in a very clear way. So the reviewer comments really not only helped me to substantively improve my writing, but also helped me to clarify my meaning. But when we do revisions, it's also very important for us to document our revisions, not only for ourselves, but also to demonstrate to the reviewers and editors that we have addressed and taken on board the letter and spirit of their comments very seriously. Over time, I have learned to really improve my work throughout the peer review process by taking on board reviewers' suggestions. So solo work or collaboration, do you do it on your own or do you do writing and publishing collectively? Before I share my experience, I would like to ask you, how much do you prefer to write and publish collaboratively or not? One means you prefer to write and publish on your own, go solo. 10 means you prefer to collaborate and publish with other people collaboratively. Where do you see it on the scale from 1 to 10? Well, as a semi-quantitative researcher, I like to see numbers coming in. So it's still changing. I'll give it a bit more time. Great, it seems to have settled. So most of us would like to publish collaboratively. We are getting a mean score of 6.6. So in my collaboration experience, I quite often collaborate for different reasons. Right at the beginning of my career, I was more collaborating to learn from my collaborators. In those instances, I tend to take on the responsibility of doing most of the hands-on work, then let my collaborator play a mentor kind of role to tell me what I have done good enough, what needs improvement. In doing that kind of collaboration, I really learned a lot from the process of hands-on doing it, and meanwhile taking on criticism to improve my work. But as I moved on in my writing and publishing experience, I did more equal contributor kind of collaboration. And there are two ways in which I have done it. As you can see on the screen, my article published with Yue Chen from British Columbia. We are both quantitative researchers, so we have the same kind of skill sets. In our collaboration, we divide up the work quite equally. Then we do our respective bits, then we piece our respective analysis and our writing together into a piece of collaborative work. But there is another mode of collaboration which draws on complementary skills between you and your collaborator, such as what I did with Sandy To from Hong Kong. When Sandy was living in Hong Kong, she was so much closer to the respondents when we were researching a remarriage in China. So what Sandy did was to have interviewed our qualitative respondents. Then I have done large-scale quantitative data analysis from afar. Then we closely discussed how the qualitative and quantitative evidence are talking to each other. Then we pieced together our respective work to have done a mixed methods piece of work. But it doesn't have to be co-authorship when we are talking about collaboration. With my friend Daniel in Shanghai, what we often do is to have each other as writing and reviewing buddies. We just constantly comment on each other's writing without claiming authorship. In doing so, we allow each other to be independent writers, to have the space to develop your own intellectual agenda, while at least having a hypercritical pair of eyes to help you to improve the work. So that also worked very well in my experience. Whatever you do, just ensure the fairness and responsibility and authorship are stated and discussed right at the beginning of the collaboration. So to avoid awkwardness, embarrassment down the line. There were quite a lot of pros of doing collaborative work, complementary skills, and you always get inspired by other people's new ideas. Whether it's more efficient, well, sometimes it can be more efficient, but sometimes it's less so. If you take time to gel with each other, to understand each other where you come from, then it might slow you down a little bit. But whatever happens, you always end up learning new things in your collaborative experience. At least I did a great deal in my collaboration. One thing we learn to do in our collaboration, or some people regard it as a negative side, is that we have to compromise in the collaboration process. Well, after all, we are not just doing our own piece of work, and we are taking on board our collaborators' ideas, then we have to make slight compromises in how we put together and piece together the puzzles in our writing and publishing. But another key to ensure successful collaboration is to communicate. If you have other work coming up on your schedule, just to communicate with your collaborators early on so they can arrange their work. Communication is key, especially nowadays we are collaborating digitally and transnationally with our colleagues across the world. 90% of the time I feel to do collaborative work is to foster greater mental health. By working with other people, we feel we are not alone. The friendship I fostered throughout my collaborative experience was really inspiring and so heartwarming throughout my publishing experience. Publishing just doesn't stop at the moment when the book is on the shelf, when an article is online or in a journal issue. We write and we publish to convey our ideas, to change the world, to change how we think about the world. So to think about impact, it needs to be an integral part of our writing, researching, and publishing experience. But once we have something published, what I often do is for every piece of my work, I do engage with the media, either going through my university media office or just to write opinion editorials, blog posts to disseminate my research findings to a broader audience. Sometimes you also have to disseminate your findings to policymakers, practitioners, community, and individuals and participants who participate in your research. Then we need to think about publication. Academic publication is not the end point of our publishing. We need to think about how we reach out to make a broader difference. In my experience, I have engaged with quite a wide range of media. I find them very rewarding because sometimes people comment on your blog post, give you fresh ideas. Lastly, I really want to talk about how we learn and care through writing and publishing. Doing a PhD and write a piece of work, especially doing solo work, can be quite lonely. But when we think about writing and publishing, we are not alone in it. We are supported by our supervisors, collaborators, friends, colleagues, family, the participants in our research. Even if we are just writing a solo piece of work, we are well supported by reviewers and editors throughout this process. So writing and publishing is a collective process. So far, we are so in it to think about writing and publishing, but it's very important for us to step back a little bit, to take a break from writing and publishing in order to write and publish better. Finally, writing and publishing, we have to think about academic care. Care is actually central to writing and publishing for me. We care about the issues we are researching, thinking about refugee children, migrants, vulnerable people during the COVID period of time. We care about them. That's why we write about them. We care about our disciplines. We care about education as an important agenda, as an important institution, practice in shaping our society. Last but not the least, we need to care for each other and we need to care for ourselves when writing. And you are your biggest asset in this process. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing any questions coming in.
Thank you so much, Jan. This is great, and I can see we already have like 20 good questions on Slido. Ollie, do you want to say the first question? Because that comes from you, the most popular one.
Yeah, I was cheeky and used my chair privileges there to ask a question to start off with, and it has got a few likes, so I'm gonna lead with that one, Yang. So what advice would you give to those ECRs who maybe don't enjoy the writing process so much? I know you said yourself you see it as a hobby. I have to hold my hands up. I'm one of those people who sometimes I can really struggle to engage in that writing process. I don't always find it that enjoyable. So what advice would you give to those sort of people?
I would say no one probably to start with enjoy writing so much. So it's always been a struggle to start with. To come to the point of enjoyment, it really takes time. So first of all, we need to really be patient with the process of getting there. But to get us started, I think one technique I used is not to focus on writing itself. So when we write, when I developed the technique of rapid writing, I was really not paying attention to writing at all. I just noted down whatever idea that came into my mind. It's just a process of recording our thoughts. And then we have the opportunity of tweaking and editing our writing as we move on. So don't think of writing as something like a first draft, it has to be perfect. One of the hurdles standing in writing a piece of work is our pressure, our internal the sort of internal eyes telling us that we have to be perfect, we have to write well. No, we don't have to. In a sense, as a second language speaker of English, what I realized as I communicated with my colleagues is that writing is no one's first language, academic writing. We all struggle with it one way or the other. So to switch your attention away from writing itself and focus on the idea is probably one way of doing it. And another practical way of doing it is I stage my writing. That's why in the first instance, I write conference papers and short reports to start with as a sort of a skeleton template for me to build on. Once you have something, then you can expand on it to develop your writing. If you really find writing difficult, you can start to make PowerPoint slides. I find that extremely helpful for me to sort out my thinking. When I have to put bullet points on the screen, that's where I am started with my thinking. That also helps me to clarify my thinking. So it doesn't have to be writing. You can draw comics to clear my mind. Then you can transform that into writing. Or you can record a video of yourself just talking to an audio recorder of your thoughts. Then you can transform that into writing. So there are a lot of lead-ins and pathways for us to write. We don't have to dive into writing right away. And that can be a daunting process.
Thanks, Yang. Yeah, and I agree. I think sometimes you're right. Having a blank Word document in front of you sometimes seems very daunting. And actually, it's using those strategies you suggested there or similar ones to try and get that process going.
What I also often do is I hate a blank Word document. So what I often do is if I'm doing an interview piece of research, I will start to think about the quotes I want to put into my writing. So at least once I have those first-hand quotes in my writing, it's not an empty document anymore. So if I'm doing a quantitative piece of work, what I often do is to have my tables and figures made first. So within the document, I already have the tables and figures, and then I write up the results. I describe the tables and my figures. Then I already have some writing in place. Then I go back to write my theory, introduction, and conclusion. So you start from the easiest part that gives you the inroad into writing something, and then it will flow, I'm sure.
Perfect. Thank you, Yang. We've had several questions, I guess, around sort of some of the how-tos of writing. So I guess they're probably another good place to start with things. So one question we had, Yang, was what sort of format of publication do you think reaches the greatest audience?
It really depends. I mean, it depends from field to field. So also, it's not just a single piece of publication. So as I do for my journal articles and book, what I do is to, in order to reach a broader audience, I do other activities surrounding the publication. So when we think about publication, it's not just that piece of work on the Sage website or Wiley's website. It's not like that. It's the whole series of activities you do after the publication, how you tailor for different audience. Sometimes you digest it for policymakers. You produce a one-page bullet points for them to read. So it really depends. I've had my journal articles reaching a broad audience, more than 10,000 readers on my first ever publication, Gender and Family Values in China. But when I write for media, you do get a much broader audience. So I wrote for Conversation. It reaches millions of audience. So it depends on who you want to talk to. I think it's not so much the question about what's the broadest, but rather who do you plan to talk to? It's the target that really matters.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And some of the pieces that I've written before have got the widest readership are things like blogs that have got out there into the public interest a little bit more than a journal article that only is read by academics sometimes.
Yeah, but if our goal is to, for example, change the academic debate, theoretical conversation, then we do need to publish in some more academic outlets in order to reach the audience who we want to reach.
Exactly.
Thanks, Yang. We've got another question from Glenn Millington. He's asking, is it advisable to submit papers to more than one journal at a time? It is frustrating to have to wait weeks for a likely rejection until you can send elsewhere.
No, the answer is very short. So we are ethically not allowed to submit one article to different journals. So we do need to tread very carefully in thinking about the time frame of publication. So we can, as I briefly mentioned in my talk, you can be thinking about look into the journals to see what's the turnaround time. Usually, on average, when are journals articles submitted and when are they accepted? You can get a sense of how long it takes. It is a waiting game, especially during the COVID period of time. The whole academy decelerated a little bit. Actually, quite often I celebrate it because it's quite a bad thing for us to live in an accelerated academy. So we need to have those moments to pause and think about what we do. So before we submit journal articles, let's do really think carefully about how we position ourselves and go through some of those serious steps before we submit. Also be grateful really for desk rejections. One thing I didn't talk about is to gauge whether your work is suitable for an outlet. What you can always do is to informally write to the editorial team just to get some comments on whether your topic fits into the remit of a journal. That will also help you to save some time. I'm sure most of the editors out there are so supportive of early career scholars, and they fully appreciate the kind of position we are in. So just reach out and ask for help. We are not alone.
Awesome. Sort of sticking with the idea of sort of best practice, Yang, when we're publishing in journals, got a question in terms of, are there any costs involved in publishing journal articles?
Usually for most academic journals, you don't need to pay. Some journals even publish your article open access for free. There are a number of them I know in my area, demographic research does so. And there are a few other outlets I'm sure Ollie is best positioned to advise in the educational field which journals are free to publish. But most journals are free to publish. You don't need to pay for the editor to handle your work. Some journals, just a few of them, they do charge a very minimal sum of submission fees. I know a few journals in the United States, they charge about $15, $20 for you to submit. That's really to maintain the editorial office because they do put a lot of time into handling hundreds of submissions every year.
Yeah, I think in my experience, journals often are free to publish in, and sometimes you get lucky, Yang, as you mentioned, and you'll get an open access publication without having to pay any fees. I think in my experience, one thing I would advise as well is that when you are being asked to pay to publish, there are sometimes those predatory journals that we see trying to sort of take our academic work. So that's always a bit of a red flag for me. So do just double check before sending anything off or make any payments if you are publishing.
Yes, indeed. There are quite a number of them out there. We need to be careful.
There are also some very open access journals. They usually have a speedy peer review process if you want to get published more quickly for a timely topic or something, you might want to pay. And usually some universities, they do have policies that you can use some funding from your university to publish open access in those journal articles without having to pay. So it's always good for you to check with your university research office about these policies as well.
Yeah, often the library will be able to give you a good advice on open access publishing.
Yeah, thanks. Another question here is about, as an ECR, how can we find collaborators? Can we show our intention directly to our advisor? Could you give us some suggestions? Thanks.
It's diverse. There are different ways of approaching a collaborator. So often in my experience, it grows out from your conferences and social networking organically. So I had that one experience of collaboration with my PhD supervisor, which worked really well for me as an apprenticeship experience to learn about the publication process. If you do have intention to think about collaborating with your PhD advisor, and do be open to talk to them about it. There is no embarrassment in telling them you want to get published. That's what we do as academics. So tell them your intention to publish and tell them about your career aspiration. And they will, I'm sure they are very happy to support you. Another avenue to get to know collaborators is at conferences. So you do network with other people, and especially at the early career network now we are in. So there are plenty of networking opportunities for us to get to know other people working on a similar topic in a similar area, or have similar research interests but complementary skills. So those are the opportunities for us to think about where we find collaborators. And I wouldn't be shy either. If I really enjoyed reading one article, I would just write to the author to tell them, I really enjoyed your article and I am curious to know more about your research. In academy, quite often, as we say, we have rejections and we have doors slamming our face. What's encouraging for us is actually for us to recognize the value of each other's work. And in doing so, that's also another avenue for us to secure collaborators. Feel free to write to them. I really enjoyed reading your work.
Definitely. And sort of on the issue of collaborators, Yang, we've got a question in terms of how would you decide first, second, third authorship order, typically when you're sort of starting out on a paper with collaborators?
It should be a truthful reflection of how much work you have done. So if you have done most of the work, you should be first. It can change. It doesn't have to be a first and second and third author right all the way as you set out to be right at the beginning. So what you can always do is to change your authorship if somebody stepped up to have taken up more responsibility in producing a piece of work. So at least to start with, if you want to talk about authorship, you can briefly talk about how you're going to divide the labor, who's going to do what. Then that can give you an indicative idea of how you want to divide the labor and what is fair for you to divide the authorship. So quite often in my experience, if I'm collaborating with someone even more junior than me, I will give them the opportunity to be the first author, because knowing that's a great opportunity for them to advance their career. That's what I have also learned from my collaboration with more senior scholars than me. They have been very kind enough to give me the opportunity to take the lead authorship, which helped me a lot in my career. So we need to take care of each other. So it's not just about, of course, we need to be fair, but there is a sense of care going on too as we divide the work.
Yeah, and I guess that lead author, Yang, will be the one typically that as well as probably writing the majority of the work and helping with pulling the manuscript together in its entirety. They'll be the one often that then deals with the submission process and liaising with editors and reviews, etc.
Yes, just to say the corresponding author doesn't necessarily have to be the first author. So that can differ too. It depends on the team arrangement. So sometimes if you're working a project, then that's a totally different arrangement. In one of my collaborative experiences, I work with a large team. So I was the last author, but I'm the corresponding author because I took part in the intellectual plot line of how to design stuff. But then my other early career scholars on the team, they worked on the bread and butter of the work. They have done the work. They deserve to be right at the front.
Thank you, Yang.
We have a related question on this, and you might have touched upon this already, Yang. To what extent does the order of authorship matter in publications?
Well, in a sense, it does matter. I think what matters more is whether you go for a solo piece of work or whether you collaborate with other people. Because at the early career stage, to be able to develop a solo piece of work, that signals to other people you are an independent researcher. So being a PhD, going through the PhD and postdoc process, that process is actually a training process for us to be independent. So if we are able and we have the opportunity to develop an independent piece of work, then go for it. Also, in my experience, my PhD supervisor was so kind and early on encouraged me to have my own intellectual independence. So she very much encouraged me to have my own work. That actually helped me a lot in learning to be independent. Collaboration is fun, collaboration is great, but also we need to develop this capability to have our own intellectual plot line, methodological skills, writing skills, to be able to have our own voice heard. So that's also very important. Then when it comes to collaborative work, of course, if the authorship is reflective of how much work you have put into it, then if you are the first author, it means you have done most of the work. Then that's also a good reflection of your commitment to the piece of work and your contribution. That will be valued too.
I think in the UK, I think this is also discipline specific and the country specific sometimes, because I know in the UK we value a balance between co-authored papers to show your networks and also single-authored papers to show your independence of research. But in some other countries, they seem to be preferring collaborative work than single-authored papers. And also in science subject, they seem to have more co-authored papers than social sciences to some extent.
Yeah, indeed. I really have to say, what I'm sharing today is really from a very saturated perspective from a social science PhD and then doing an academic career in the UK. So it doesn't really necessarily apply to some other places or subjects. Yes, it depends on different projects. Well, if you have a big group in your research team, then it means you do it together. And also your personal preference. That's probably most important of all, is do you enjoy working with other people or do you enjoy working on your own? Why do you, you don't necessarily have to force yourself to do something that you don't enjoy.
Okay, going to broach a topic that can be tricky sometimes, Yang, and you mentioned in your talk that, you know what, reviewers aren't your enemy, and I agree with that. So how do you decide whether or not to accept suggested revisions when it comes to journal articles? What are your tips trying to negotiate that process? Because it can be quite difficult.
So I was indeed very defensive when I first received my first set of review. I was so defensive and precious about my work, thinking I have done my best. I think it's fantastic. Then why can people still criticize me? I was having that mentality to start with. But what I learned is when I receive peer reviews, I often just have a first glance through it, then just put it aside for about a week for them to sink in, not to just react right away to say, oh, whether this is reasonable or not reasonable. Give yourself a certain distance to step back from the reviews, to think about your work. I would say 99% of the time, I will really take the comments very seriously, even if some of the reviews were written in a very aggressive tone. Sometimes, unfortunately, I do take my time to think about it, to see if by switching the angle, turning things around, whether there is a tiny bit in there that's going to help with my work. If it does, then I do take it on board. As authors, I think we need to take responsibility for our works and our publication and writing. So I think whatever criticism, if it's coming towards you in the peer review process, it will come to you again after it's published. So if you are given an opportunity before it's formally published and out there being said, being with you for life and after your life once and for all, so you have the opportunity to think about all of those different voices that might come to you, then that's a great opportunity to reflect on what we do. So I do tend to take the reviews very positively. Sometimes they're really difficult to address, but I do take my time to do so. So if you do have an extremely difficult point, again, you're not alone. Talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues, share the peer review at that point with your friends to see if they have better ideas in addressing the point, if they have recommended methodology, literature. So I always, if I come to those desperate moments, I do join other people to help me to think about how I address the different points. So of course, in those processes, I'm more than willing to reciprocate the favor with my friends. So it's all a sort of a networking and helping each other scenario instead of fighting it alone scenario.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, Yang, that you have to sort of detach that emotional response, because sometimes when you get critique, and sometimes it can be a little bit harsh, if the tone isn't right in that review, it's important to sort of get over that and distance yourself from that before you maybe try and start doing that work. I think a key thing for me when I've been sort of getting better in that academic writing process is remembering that the version you submit to the journal is still a draft version. Don't see it as the finalized version. I think sometimes we often think that when we submit it, it's done, but it's not. So it's better to see it as another draft version going in that you're going to get feedback on, I always think.
That's great. Certainly, expectation management is key. So just to bear in mind, nothing, if at all possible, will be accepted outright. You always have to do some sort of a revision because you writing the peer review process is an interactive process. We are not only hoping to just get our voice heard. The purpose of getting our voice heard is to have some voices coming back to us. So in the peer review process, those voices are coming back to us. We need to engage with them. And just also to think it's not a criticism of you as an author, it's the points to help you to improve your work or think through different angles about your work. So if you just distance yourself a little bit from your work, that will also help us to survive the process. It can be a quite soul destroying, thinking about, am I good for nothing, or am I, despite all my efforts, have I done good enough? Why am I not good enough? It's not a matter of whether it's good enough. It's a matter of perspective. People are coming from different perspectives, especially in social sciences. We follow different traditions and we follow different thoughts. And the very idea of peer review and publishing is to start a conversation.
Thanks, Yang. That was brilliant.
Yeah, I think that's really thoughtful. So we have another question about, is there a way of finding out which journals are more likely to accept papers from new academics or more likely to accept papers full stop?
That's a tough question. I think irrespective of our career stage, I think all submissions and papers will be treated fairly and equally by different journals. So I wouldn't say some journals give preference to early career scholars, because after all, it's a judgment of the quality of your work. Which journals are easier to get into? Well, different journals are competitive to different levels. A number of journals in my field, I know, they publish their acceptance rate on their respective websites. So for example, American Sociological Association, British Sociological Association, on their flagship, for their flagship journals, they do publish roughly what's the percentage of paper they accept every year. So that will give you an indication of how difficult it is to get into a journal. But I wouldn't really absolutely use those metrics and numbers to judge whether you as an individual or you and your collaborators, your individual piece of work will be able to get into a journal. Because after all, it's your intellectual contribution that matters. So how much you're speaking to the audience of a given journal, what's the quality of your work? Because to say 1 out of 20 chances or 1 out of 10, it doesn't mean you're not the one. So who knows? I think in my experience, I wouldn't worry too much about whether a journal has a very low acceptance rate. What my focus and attention will be paid to polish my work, to really think through it, to make it relevant to ongoing debates, and to very clearly articulate my contributions to the field. So quite often, as I said, when I first started, I said, oh, this is something no one has done before. Then I'm doing something new. It's worthy of publication. But that's not the case. We have to think about what kind of contributions we are making here, and also justify why should our contribution matter, to whom it matters. Once you justify those in your own brain and in your writing in a very clarified way, then that will help you to speak to the journal as well as your audience.
I think I completely agree with that. Especially having recently become a journal editor, I was reviewing the metrics for the journal, and it turns out some papers where we rejected, they get published in actually higher impact factor journals. That's also possible. I think it's also a fit for purpose, and it's a fit. And also, I think another strategy would be when you do your literature review or when you are reading articles, you can always see what journals have published similar topics and similar articles in your field. Then those journals might be the ones you could consider in that process, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thinking along the line of sort of metrics, Yang, we've had a question in terms of how do you sort of balance the quantity and quality with regard to journal articles? How do you strike a balance there, especially when you've got to think about those wider commitments like you mentioned, like teaching responsibilities, admin responsibilities?
Well, when I'm thinking about what's good about a journal submission, what's a good outlet for my work, sometimes the so-called higher ranking journals, they tend to get more exposure. They tend to get a greater readership. So that might be one of the considerations. I wouldn't say impact factor is a very good indicator of the exposure of your work because you want to speak to the right audience. Of course, we want to publish in places where our works are getting read. There is no shame in saying that. We write for our stuff to get read. So publish in places where you expect to have a big readership is something we need to take into consideration. I know in different countries, we have different assessment systems. At least in sociology, in my discipline, in the REF, the metrics are not necessarily tying into REF rating. So in a sense, in sociology, we are not necessarily under the same pressure to say you have to publish in the American Journal of Sociology to be a REF 4-star piece of work. It doesn't mean that, luckily in my field. But when in some other fields, probably we need to take into account which journals are recognized. In those cases, I think as PhD students, our supervisors are the best people to advise us with regards to where to publish, which journals will give us a head start in terms of our career. So I would say find a balance of what you want and what you want to achieve through your writing.
Great. We've got question about any tips to keep track of and respond to call for papers or chapter submissions to edited volumes. Sometimes seems like they get shared within a closed club.
In my experience, I follow different organizational websites, such as BERA. There is a website and section call for papers. So I do sign up to a number of organizations that's very closely related to my research. And they mailing lists, for example, they quite often circulate different special issue call for papers, call for chapters. So do search online and also go through the early career network of BERA. Then we can think about what where we submit. One thing about special issues is that it's not necessarily faster for early career scholars. It takes time. Usually there is a set time frame for special issues or for edited books. So the time frame, sometimes it doesn't necessarily work towards early career scholars' advantage. Knowing that it's the slowest piece of work in that special issue, that's going to determine how fast the special issue as a whole will be published. So I will probably personally think very carefully about the time frame balance of special issues and edited books. But I'm not saying we shouldn't submit to them. If they are quite often a special collection makes a collective voice in academia to our field. That's also a good opportunity to engage as a collective instead of doing it on your own. But sometimes we also need to take into account the kind of time frame involved. So communicate with the guest editors. You will get a very good sense of where we are and how you strategize.
And that's a really good point, Yang. I recently had a paper published in a special issue. The special issue came out 12 months after we had our paper accepted because we were waiting for other authors in that special issue. The balance was kind of struck because actually there's been an awful lot of interest in that special issue like you mentioned, but we had to wait quite a while to get that paper out. So definitely want to think about for early career researchers in terms of timeliness.
Yes.
I think in terms of sticking on the idea of special issues and reviews, someone's talked about, do you think it's a useful process to try and get into reviewing to help with that academic writing?
Very much. I'm absolutely, if you have the opportunity to do peer review, I've learned so much from doing peer review by looking at how other people develop their research. And sometimes in peer review, you also get the opportunity, almost always nowadays, to see how other peer reviewers review the same piece of work. So I find that to be an invaluable experience to see how other scholars are viewing the same piece of work in different ways through different angles, or sometimes your points do concur. So to see work in progress, it will help you to judge what is a publishable standard. You will see what's coming through the pipeline. You will also get to understand the point that some of the work in progress are not perfect. The peer review process is really to help the different pieces of work to improve throughout the pipeline. So that will actually boost, probably impart your confidence to think about what is ready for publication and what is ready for submission. So I do review a lot nowadays, and I enjoy doing review. And especially if you input into the process and you make constructive and encouraging comments, you see that the work improving. That's really a heartwarming process to see you can become a part of other people's work in that way. But that's also a way of contributing to your field. So we contribute to the field in different capacity, in different ways, in different roles. And peer reviewing is what we give back to the system.
Yeah. And I often find that editors are really willing to have early career researchers come on board as reviewers for them. I know many journals struggle to find enough reviewers to get journals reviewed and through the system. So I don't think there's any harm in an early career researcher dropping an email to an editor expressing an interest. The worst thing they can say is that, oh, maybe you're not quite ready just yet. But I think many would bite your hand off to review a paper at this moment in time anyway.
And also just to mention, I know a few associations in different disciplines. They do run early career peer review training programs. So before we start our first piece of peer review, if we have an opportunity to take part in one of those training programs, that's really helpful for us to think about how we make constructive points and what we look out for in peer review. So we don't end up becoming one of the aggressive reviewers. So here I really want to thank all of the peer reviewers who supported my works throughout the years. They have been so encouraging. And once we start to give back to the system, we strive to do our best to be one of those supportive peer reviewers to really make the works we review better.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing we can always think about with reviews is that early career researchers often can volunteer to review books for journals and get their book reviews published. I act as a book reviews editor for a journal in my particular field of education. And I know I get a lot of feedback from those that do book reviews. It's a really nice sort of easy way into the journal. It's often a softer, more informal introduction to reviewing a piece of work and getting something published in the journal. So I think book reviews are often an underutilized resource by ECRs in terms of getting your name out there, doing something in the field and getting in touch with journals.
Indeed, indeed. It's a great opportunity to write shorter pieces. and to get a sense of academic writing. And also that gives you an opportunity to go through the online submission system to understand how it operates. So great, yeah, that's indeed.
And again, I think journals are struggling to find people to review books for them. So for ECRs, it's always good for you to get in touch with journals and saying you are interested in reviewing books for them. They would be really welcoming that our journal would do that. I think I'm conscious of time, so I think this last question might be relevant to most of the audiences today. In which year of the PhD should I think about publishing and drafting, and also how to publish from your PhD thesis into journal articles?
I would say plan as early as possible. I started to think about publishing from my PhD early on in year 1 of my PhD. So after that first meeting I mentioned in my talk with my supervisor, month 3 I decided I want to publish my PhD thesis as a book. So I wrote it as a book. But what I also planned for my career is knowing that to be able to find an academic job, you have to demonstrate that you're capable of publishing. So that meant from early on, I decided to do a couple of journal articles on the sideline, in addition to my PhD thesis. So that actually helped me in finding a job after my graduation, also gaining journal article publishing experience. I would say starting from year 1, think about publishing your PhD thesis. First of all, think about the format, and then think about where you want to take it. If you decide to publish journal articles, then clearly that's going to determine how are you going to organize your thesis into those 3 empirical chapters or 3 journal articles. And then that encourages you to think about which chapter or which journal article you want to work on first. That will give you the head start in terms of publishing. So it's plan early is always a good thing. Plan early doesn't mean you have to submit a journal article in the first year of your PhD. It always, the first piece, it does take a long period of time, but you'd rather take a longer period of time to really understand what it takes to publish and how to do a publication right, instead of rushing into your first piece of publication. Because once you have done it one time, you will get a hand of the game, and knowing how to get published later on, your second piece of work and third piece of work will come more naturally. So do take the time to do your first piece and think about where you want to get published. After all, that's your initial introduction of yourself to the publishing world. So you want to have a proper introduction of yourself, not to rush onto the stage.
Right. So I think we are getting very close to drawing our session today to a conclusion. We've had some fantastic questions, and I don't think we even got through half of them because there were that many shared with us. So thank you to those who shared questions. Apologies if we haven't managed to answer those just yet. We will look to do some sort of follow-up from today's webinar. We're not sure what format that might take just yet, but we will look through a follow-up where we can try and answer hopefully the rest of those questions for you, because there are some really useful questions that I think everyone will benefit who's taken part in today's session. We'd like to thank Yang for presenting today and taking us through what's been a really enjoyable session. I hope everyone else has found it as enjoyable as I certainly have, and hopefully is useful. The academic publishing world, I always think, can be a little bit of a mystery until you start to take a bit of a foray into it. So take some of Yang's advice today, apply that to your work, and start to take those little footsteps into that world a little bit more. Don't think that's anything else from me, Yue, if you've got anything you'd like to finish off with.
Nope, but just want to add thanks to the Chinese Educational Research Association as well in collaborating with us in terms of those webinars and also our future academic for publications workshops.
We have got a short opportunity for you to provide some feedback on today's session at the end, so please don't leave straight away. There'll be a short video played where you can provide some feedback to us, which will be very useful for planning future events.
Can I just say thank you all very much for participating in today's event. I know you are from all different parts of the world. It's very nice getting to know you in this way, although I haven't had much of an opportunity to hear from you. Surely in the future, we will engage with each other one way or the other. And also thank the BRA and CERA for hosting this event. This really has given me an opportunity to take stock and think about my own publication experience and reflect on all of them. So thank you very much. And lastly, I'd like to thank the BRA staff working on the backstage so hard and to make sure we are having a smooth running event. Thank you all very much.
Perfect. So thank you everyone again. We hope you've had an enjoyable webinar with us today, and we'll leave you to enjoy the rest of your days, afternoons, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.